This is a list of the world's religions, the major religions of the world today, by date of founding, as best we understand. It's believed the oldest world religion, and by world religion we mean a religion that is both of significant size, that it affects a large population, but also that it crosses borders. It's not limited to one specific geographical area. Hinduism can be, at least the foundations, the Vedic faith that led to modern Hinduism, began as early as 4000 to 2500 BC in the Indus Valley, the Indus River, which has always been part of India until the formation of Pakistan. Part of it is in India, part of it is in Pakistan now, and the Indus Valley civilization is one of the oldest civilizations, one of the four oldest civilizations that we know of in history. And so Hinduism is the oldest, followed by Judaism, which began around 2000 BC. That's when the call came to Abraham. Then Buddhism, which we will obviously be talking about today, began in India around 560 to 490 BC. Chinese traditional religions, and later on in this trip I'll be talking about Chinese religions, and particularly Confucianism, Taoism. They have brands of Buddhism, so we'll get into some of that. Legalism, which you may never have heard of because it's not dominant today, but it was a significant religion in the history of China. And then Jainism, Christianity, Islam, Sikhism. The families of religions, in order to give you kind of a framework for this, there are three major modern families of religions. The one we are most familiar with are the Abrahamic religions, the monotheisms of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. All three of the great monotheistic religions in the world, and that constitutes half the population of the planet, are all linked back to one man, Abraham. All of the three monotheistic religions are Abrahamic religions because they see their roots going back to Abraham. That's true for Islam as well as Judaism and Christianity. So that's one of the major religious family groups. The second one are called the Dharmic religions. These are religions that came out of India. Dharma means the teaching. We're talking about Hinduism, Buddhism, Jainism, and Sikhism here. If you don't know what Jainism or Sikhism are, then grab me over a cup of coffee and I'll explain them to you a little bit. They are considered world religions. Now, Buddhism began in India, but we're going to be talking about it today with relationship to Japan and its various forms. And Buddhism has gone through a very interesting transformation from its founding in India, actually the edge of Nepal on northern India, to the modern day and what it looks like in particularly the Far East, the areas that we're visiting. The third major family of religion are the Taoic religions. Those are particularly prominent in the Far East, especially China and Japan. They include Taoism, Confucianism, both of which I'm going to talk about when I talk about the religions of China, and Shinto. Shinto being the national religion of Japan. So I'm going to be talking about that in this hour. And also other versions of Buddhism. As I say, Buddhism has gone through some interesting transformations, and it is very different in the Far East than it was when it began in India, and I'll talk about that a little bit. Sometimes you can include other religions which are not considered world religions now, but are of a unique type. They are the Iranian religions, the Persian-based religions, particularly Zoroastrianism, Mandaeism, and the Kurdish Yazdanism, which you may have heard about because of the persecution that the Iraqis had, the ISIL had against some of these, the Yazidis, the Alevis, and others. So these are Persian or Iranian-based religions. Most of them are very small today, although they're still out there. I met a family on one of these cruises who, it's a couple and their two adult daughters, and they were Zoroastrians. Which is Parsis is the word that they use for it in India, and there are still Parsi fire temples around the world. There are still towers of silence. One of the things that they do in Zoroastrianism is when someone dies, they believe to bury them pollutes the soil with a dead body, and so they have towers of silence where they lay them out and allow them to be eaten by vultures. Well, one of the problems is they have to keep breeding vultures because it gets very complicated. But anyway, it's fascinating, all these different religions. So these are the major families. We are going to be looking at the Buddhism as one of the Dharmic religions, And then the Taoic religions, especially Shinto today, and versions of Buddhism. When we talk about Chinese religions, we'll get into Taoism, Confucianism, legalism, etc. Okay? And by the way, if anybody has any questions as we go along, I don't have to wait till the end to answer any questions. I'm flexible. Just throw a shoe or, scream or whatever you have to do. I'll be happy to answer questions. If I'm saying something and you really don't get it and I need to explain it right then. There is one astonishing thing about the foundation. This is the same list I gave you a minute ago, except for the box on it. There was a period of time in the, as you can see, around 500 BC, from 490 to 560 BC, a 100-year period when 4 of the major world religions were founded at pretty much the same time. This is so important historically, and nobody knows why this is, because they happened in far distant places. The Gautama Buddha, who founded Buddhism, Lao Tzu, who is responsible for Taoism, Confucius, and I'm using their westernized versions of the names because you probably wouldn't recognize them if we used the traditional names that they use in Asia. They were all alive at the same time. In fact, when I talk about the religions of China, I've got some paintings of what it would have been like for Confucius and Lao Tzu and Buddha to have met. There's a famous painting called The Vinegar Tasters that includes representations of all 3 of those men. So we don't know exactly why this is, but this is a phenomena that 4 major world religions, well actually more than 4 because Chinese traditional religions includes Taoism and Confucianism. So just fascinating piece of information there, okay? Today I want to start with the traditional national religion of Japan, which is Shinto. And I do apologize for these talks. I have more words on the screen than usual. Ordinarily I just have images and I provide the words, but some of this stuff is difficult enough to understand, and I think that if you read it as I talk about it, then you'll be able to retain it a little bit better maybe. And there will be a test. People have been asking for that, so we will have a test. Oh, come on, laugh. That was, I'm not going to give you a test. Shinto, the national religion, the folk religion of Japan, literally is translated into the way of the gods. Shin, or kami, is the word for it today, means spirits, or gods, or ghosts almost. It's an essence of beings, that are left behind. It includes ancestors. It includes great figures like the emperors were seen as having kami or shin, and it used to be Shindo. And if you know anything about do means the way of. So Shindo, or Shinto as it's used now, means the way of the gods. It's an animistic folk religion. Now people will argue with that. Sociologists argue over whether it's truly animistic. Animism is the belief, and it's the most ancient, more ancient even than Hinduism, the belief that all things, particularly living things, have spirits. There is the spirit of the tree, and the spirit of the river, and the spirit of the mountain, and the spirit of the wolf. And people have spirits. Well, the idea behind Shinto is that all of these elements, all of these natural things in the world, including people, have spirits, or kami, that are eternal, that exist forever. So the idea is, in Japan, the gods, the kami, the spirits, however you want to refer to them, the essences, some people have said, doesn't translate perfectly, that they exist, and Shinto as a religion focuses on ritual practices to establish a connection between our present-day lives and the kami, particularly the kami that represent ancient times, like ancestors. You have heard of ancestor worship. Well, this is what they're talking about when they say that. Now, it's not worship in the sense that you might think of worship, bowing down, and there's some of that. We'll talk about it. It gets a little complicated. Shinto and Asian Buddhism are linked together in Japan. In fact, they have an expression that they use in Japan that is Shinbutsu Shugo. Shinbutsu Shugo is Japanese, and it means that the religions of Buddhism and Shinto have been intertwined. There's a syncretism is the blending of things. That there are people who would call themselves Buddhists and yet go to Shinto shrines, or call themselves Shinto and yet go to Buddhist shrines and practice rituals across there. It's interesting that when they've done surveys in Japan and asked people what religion they belong to, almost nobody will say that they're Shinto. Because in Japan, they don't think of Shinto as being a religion. Religion is something you join and that you participate in as a member. Shinto is a way of life for Japanese. Many of the people who would say, I'm Buddhist or even Christian, would also participate in Shinto ritual. In fact, one saying is that in Japan, people get married as Christians, they live as Shinto, and they get buried as Buddhists. Because there's an interweaving of those things. And the Japanese people, because they like nice things and they like big parties, they love the Christian weddings. Big white dresses and expensive receptions and all of that. So they often will have Christian styled weddings with the dresses and the whole thing. Shinto is how they practice their everyday life, an effort to be in connection with their ancestors and with the spirits that are around them, and to make that connection across time in a spiritual way. But Shinto is fairly, because purity and purification are major aspects of Shinto, dead bodies are not very popular in Shinto. And so the whole Shinto theology of what happens when you die and what happens to your body tends to be pretty dark. For instance, they have a belief in Shinto that the afterlife is a place called Yomi, which is a place of shadow and of darkness, very much like the Greek concept of Hades. Well, that doesn't sound nearly as good as some of the Buddhist ideas about the Elysian fields, and which is not a Buddhist expression, but the idea of Pure Land Buddhism, for instance. You're going to be taken to paradise with the Amida Buddha. I'll tell you about that one and how Buddhism has changed. So there's a very different kind of approach to religious beliefs in Japan. They mix them together for different parts of their life. And so it's very difficult to nail it down and say how many are Shinto. But it's estimated that 80% of all Japanese will have a Shinto shrine in their homes. It's the Japanese word for it, kameda, literally means a god shelf, where they will recognize and practice acknowledgement of their ancestors or other great spirits, the kami that they have in their lives or that are in nature. So this is very foreign to us, in those of us from the West who are monotheists and don't really experience that sort of thing very often. By the way, I should say this is an image of the creation of the Japanese islands. There is a creation myth that they have in Japan that the original creators, a man and a woman, dipped a spear into the water, and when they drew it back out again, the drips of the water formed the islands of Japan. And so Japan sees itself as being divinely inspired and created. So it's very important to them, their creation myth. Shinto theology, as I say, the primary focus is on the kami, and it can be interpreted God, spirit, the spiritual essence that inhabits all things. There is seen a universal kind of energy, Mubuto it's called, the energy that connects all things. The kami are reflections of that are connected to not only living things, but it's believed that a beautiful waterfall has a kami, that a beautiful tree, an ancient stone, things in nature can have kami. And this is one of the reasons that Shinto and Buddhism as well, especially Pure Land Buddhism that we'll talk about, that they have been strong influences on the development of the aesthetic. For instance, the aesthetic of Japanese gardens. If you've ever gone into a Japanese garden and you feel the peacefulness of it, well, that's whether you're feeling the presence of the kami or not. Remember, I'm a Presbyterian minister. Whether you're experiencing that or not, the idea is that it was designed with the intention that you have a spiritual experience when you get there. All right, and there is this sort of astonishing beauty and calmness that comes in the Japanese gardens. Much of that is part of the theology of Shinto that has led them to that. Secondly, there is what's called the Kanagara. Sometimes it's the Kanagara no Kami, which means the way of the Kami. And in this way, it means the pathway of the Kami. It is the way you should act in order to be respectful to the spirits, in order to be in connection with the spirits, and the natural order of things. It's how you should live your life so that you are not cut off from spiritual matters, but rather that though you're living right now in a physical body, you are open to communication with and inspiration from and connection to the spiritual world. And once you have achieved that, then you are able to create these beautiful gardens. Then you are able to not be stressed out by everything. You will have a calm, you will have a sense of who you really are in the universe, according to Shinto, right? Then, somebody want to pronounce that for me? That's Amino Manaki Nushi. It is the original or first spirit, the first coming, the heavenly ancestral God of the originating heart of the universe. This is the first spirit that then created the two spirits, the second and third kami, Inami and Inazi, I think I'm pronouncing those wrong, the two creator spirits that led to the creation of the Japanese islands. So they do have a sense that there are great kamis, the original ones. And then we have the Izanagi, that's what it was, and Izanami, the creation of the Japanese islands from the two gods. Izanagi means he who invites, and Izanami means she who is invited. In fact, there's a story about when they first were created and they met one another, she spoke first. And that was all wrong. And so they had to back up and get away from each other and start all over again, because he had to be the one to first speak to her. Because he is the one who invites, she is the one who is invited. This is it's a male-female role thing. But they have legends about how this didn't go right the first time and they had to start all over again. It created all kinds of problems. So this is some of the Shinto theology. There are a number of different types of Shinto. It's not just one thing. The most popular and common is shrine Shinto. Throughout all of Japan, there are Shinto shrines. These shrines are used for worship, for events. People come there to get in touch with the kami. A shrine is seen as a place where the kami lives. It's sort of a house of the kami, not that they're restricted to that, but that is a place where they can be shown honor. And so the shrines are considered very holy places. You will, in Japan, I'm sure you've seen what are called torii. There are these gates that have two crossbars at the top. The torii is supposed to be the entrance to a sacred place, and it marks the entrance. For Shinto, as well as some of the Buddhist shrines in Japan, there is only one entrance. There may sometimes be two, but usually there's only one. Because the idea is that this sacred place, this shrine and the area surrounding it, and usually surrounding the shrine is a garden, a Japanese-style garden, which has been very carefully created to encourage the connection with the spiritual. Well, there's only one way to get in and out, because this is an area that is set aside for spiritual things and is intentionally separated from the physical world, set aside. And so the torii gates is a mark of how you enter into the sacred place. There is also imperial household Shinto, which is only for the imperial family. On the grounds of the imperial palace, there are 3 Shinto shrines, and the imperial family only can worship at those 3 shrines. We then have folk Shinto, which is fragmented folk beliefs. There's a lot of superstition, a lot of belief in different deities and spirits. Some of this has to do with shaman kind of healing. There is possession and prophetic work. It's a very primitive kind of Shinto that goes back to old traditions. We then have sect Shinto, which are private, local religious community shrines. Shinto is the official religion of Japan. And so the government, for many, many years, sponsored the shrines. In fact, the Meiji, remember when I talked about the history, the Meiji Restoration when they finally got the power back away from the shoguns and gave it to the emperor in the Meiji Restoration, well, the Meiji emperor and those immediately following him tried to completely get rid of Buddhism and the influence that Buddhism had had in favor of Shinto. And so they were sponsoring Shinto. Later on, they realized that that wasn't the best idea, and so the private support of Shinto occurred, and there is an association of Shinto shrines in Japan that manages, I think it's 88,000 different Shinto shrines in the islands of Japan. So, and there are more than 80,000 priests associated with Shinto in Japan. And then finally, Koshinto, literally old Shinto. Its desire, sort of along with what the Meiji Restoration tried to do, is to restore Shinto to pre-Buddhist times. I told you that the Shinbutsu Shogu, which is the syncretic connection or interweaving of Shinto and Buddhism in Japan, is very, very common. The vast majority of people would be willing to say, yes, I'm Shinto, but I practice Buddhist ritual, or I'm Buddhist, I practice Shinto ritual. There's an effort today, just like the Meiji Emperor had, to try to get rid of that Buddhist influence and to go back to a purer form of the Shinto. So that's the Ko-Shinto. Ko means old. So it means the old Shinto. I'm not going to say anything more about Shinto at this point. It's a complicated religion. There's no simple way to do this. For me to try to introduce you to Shinto and then the various forms of Far Eastern Buddhism in 40 or 45 minutes is kind of silly, but we're going to try to do it anyway, all right? This gives you an idea of the development of the Indian religions, or the Vedic religions, as we talked about, which is one of the major families. Early Middle Vedic period goes back to 2000 or even 4000 BC, which is the number I had under Hinduism, because that's the foundation for the Hindu faith. Hinduism as we know it today was actually brought into its current form about 800 BC, 800 years before the time of Christ. And by the way, I use BC and AD. On the bus today, because Taiwan is not a predominantly Christian country, our guide was trying to explain CE and BCE. And people got very confused. For those countries that are not Christian, or modern scholars who don't want to have Christianity, because BC means before Christ, AD means Anno Domini, the year of our Lord. Well, to remove that, the designations they use are BCE, which means before the Common Era, and then CE, the Common Era, so that there's no particular religious association made with that. But that just confuses people, so I use BC and AD, if that's okay with you. Yes?
Is the Common Era still defined by the birth of Christ?
Yes, it is. I mean, basically that's when all the calendars change. So it's the same point of reference, but they use a different name for it, so that it doesn't have a particular religious connotation. So Hinduism, in the form we know it today, was put together or kind of finalized around 800 BC. And from the same early Vedic period, we got both Judaism and Jainism. And again, if you're interested in what Jainism is about, I can talk to you about that. But Buddhism came along around 560 to 490 BC. And then from Hinduism, we also, there was a line to Sikhism. Sikhism is, and this is a very crude, inappropriate probably generality, but it's Sikhism is sort of a little Hindu and a little Muslim. It's kind of a combination between the two. I mean, it's a legitimate religion, but it has aspects of both. And then eventually Islam, came from that line, but with a very distinct kind of reference. So let's talk about Buddhism and the Buddha. As we said, Buddhism began in somewhere around 500 BC, 560 to 490 BC, so we're talking 2,500 years ago. The founder was Siddhartha Gautama, the Buddha, the enlightened one, or the awakened one. Now, he is not the only Buddha that is recognized in Buddhism. It is believed there have been many Buddhas. Now, depending upon which branch of Buddhism, some of them would say that all the Buddhas that have been since Siddhartha Gautama were reincarnations, if you will. They were, because reincarnation is an important part of the Indian religions. Both Hinduism and Theravada Buddhism, which is the original Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism means the school of the fathers. It's the old one, and it's the one that was proposed by Siddhartha Gautama. Because he was working in southern Nepal and India, he was dealing with the Hindu environment. And a very important part of the Hindu faith, and therefore early Buddhism, was the idea of transmigration of the soul, what we know of as reincarnation. It is called samsara in Hinduism and in early Buddhism. It basically means that there is a constant cycle of birth, life, death, and rebirth. Life, death, and rebirth. And so samsara was one of the things that Gautama Buddha was trying to deal with, this cycle, because he recognized that life was all about suffering. I'm going to get into that. But one of the things that happened is when Buddhism began to spread to other areas that had not come out of Hinduism, they didn't have a belief in transmigration of the soul, or samsara. And their big deal, unlike the Hindus that had been the early followers of Buddha, they didn't have this big deal about dying and being born again. You know, what's that all about? And so the other Buddhisms that developed, the largest school of Buddhism today is called Mahayana Buddhism. It means the great vehicle, and underneath that there are dozens of different kinds of Buddhism. Most of them do not, while they all talk about relief of suffering and that sort of thing, they do not have the same major focus on this kind of rebirth. Plus, Buddhism is a non-theistic religion. The Gautama Buddha did not present any proposal about God, about a creator God. Most of the immediate brands or flavors of Buddhism that came after him didn't either. It was only later that they began to say, well, the Buddha, some other like Mahayana Buddhists, started saying the Buddha is actually an eternal being, and he was just manifest or incarnate as the Gautama, and he's been reincarnated in other forms, and so therefore he is sort of a divine being. I believe Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, if he walked in today, he would be mortified that people were worshiping him. That was not part of his original belief. His original focus was, how do you get rid of human suffering? We'll talk about that. The major traditions, Theravada, the school of the elders or fathers, is the original version. Mahayana, the great vehicle, which it's a great vehicle because it has a lot of different people writing on it. Pure Land, we're going to talk about Zen Buddhism you've heard of, Nichiren, Tibetan or Vajrayana Buddhism, which is the most esoteric, the most mysterious of them. Some of that's carried over as one of the lesser schools. That is what they practice in Tibet, but it's carried over somewhat into Japan as well. So we're talking here about Thailand, China, Burma, Japan, East Asia. Buddhism is not a dominant religion in India anymore. Buddhism left India and began to influence all the areas east of that, and particularly because of the Silk Road, which is another talk I'm going to do during this trip. The Silk Road was a connection not only for marketing purposes, not only was it moving of product, but it was moving of ideas and religions. And Buddhism spread to the east and ended up influencing all of these countries that became, some of them predominantly Buddhist, at the same time that Buddhism was primarily dying out in India, where it started, okay? So, Buddhism is based upon four noble truths, and these are the noble truths that Buddha himself, the Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, came up with. The first is the truth of dukkha. Dukkha means suffering. All life is suffering. Now, before he got to this, just a real quick biography of Gautama Buddha. He was born as a prince. His father was a wealthy man, and when the Gautama Buddha was just a child, a prophet came through, a soothsayer, and said that the boy was either going to be a great king or he's going to be a great holy man, depending upon what he saw in the world. Well, his father locked him in the palace until he was, well into his adulthood. Would not let him get outside because his father wanted him to be a ruler. He didn't want him to be a holy man. Eventually, Buddha gets outside, and he has the four sights of humanity. He had no sense of human suffering. He was wealthy. He saw an old man. He saw a sick man. He saw a corpse. And he saw an ascetic holy man. Ascetic meaning self-denial, that that they fast to extreme, etc. This really affected the Buddha, and he decided he was going to spend his life trying to figure out the cause of these various kinds of suffering, or dukkha. Because the first thing he figured out was that all of life involves suffering. Okay, that's true for all of us still today. Secondly, the Buddha, the Gautama Buddha, determined the truth of the origin of dukkha was our own craving, our own clinging to pleasure, our aversion to what's not pleasurable, the cause of all suffering and of samsara, this rebirth, death, rebirth, life, death, and the suffering that occurred through all of that. And by the way, one of the other theological, I think I've got a slide on this. Hang on a second. Okay, I don't. You've all heard the word karma. Karma is the result of how you live your life. If you live your life well and you do good work in Buddhism, then you will be rewarded. Your samsara will mean you come back in a better situation than you were in. If you live a life that is selfish and greedy and antagonistic toward others, and you're not a nice person, then you will come back either as a lesser person, a slave, somebody with disabilities, something negative, or even come back as a non-human. From a class I taught once, I had a roommate long before I met Carolyn, and he put it in a fairly crude way, but it's actually pretty accurate. He said, so if I get this right, if I live according to karma and samsara, if I live my life well, I'm a good person, I get to come back as another person. If I live my life really badly, I come back as a toad. If I am really, really, really good, I don't have to come back at all, which is the principle of nirvana. When you break the cycle of samsara, when you are enlightened, you no longer have to be reborn. And the goal, nirvana literally means extinguished or nothingness. It means no longer having to go through the suffering of life. That was the goal in Theravada Buddhism. And that was great for people who believed in samsara and believed in rebirth and all that, but when Buddhism began to go to countries that didn't have that focus, they went, the idea of just not existing anymore being your goal doesn't sound that great to me. Let's come up with some other ideas. And so other kinds of Buddhism came up with very different ideas about that. So, the truth of the origin of dukkha is our own craving, our own desire for things, our own dissatisfaction. The truth of the cessation or the end of dukkha is if we can put an end to our craving and our clinging, that will end suffering. Then there would be no more rebirth, there would be no more dissatisfaction, and no re-dying, no longer having to arise. Now, Buddha went through a period of time where he tried different things. Meditation, he tried asceticism, he almost starved himself to death. In fact, there are some astonishing sculptures and paintings of the Buddha during that period where he looks like a skeleton. And then later on, he decided that the right thing was the middle way. Not terrible asceticism and not allowing yourself all of the pleasures of the flesh. But rather not to focus on those things at all, either to deny yourself or to give yourself everything, but rather focus on your spiritual side and not live craving things. The truth of the path of liberation from dukkha is the noble eightfold path that Buddha came up with. And if you look, one of the primary symbols for Buddhism is an eight-spoked wheel because of the eightfold path. And this is what it is. This is how Buddha said you get out of all of this. First, you need to have right view, which means a right perception about things. That you need to accept the Four Noble Truths as being accurate. Get your mind in the right place. Secondly, you have to have the right intention, the right thoughts, the right aspirations. You need to be seeking after the right things. Third, you need the right speech. You don't speak falsehood, you don't abuse, you don't chatter. All right? Right speech. The fourth is right action, that you act morally and you cause no harm. This is the reason most Buddhists, for instance, are vegetarian. Because even harm to animals is a concern. Now, they're not as bad as the Jains. The Jains will wear masks and sweep the sidewalk in front of them with brooms because the idea of stepping on even an insect is horrible to them. Then right livelihood. What you do to make a living makes a difference. No working with weapons, no degradation, no meat, no intoxicants, no poisons. 6, the right effort, that you need to discipline yourself in thought, word, and deed. 7, right mindfulness, being alert to all that affects us, paying attention. My wife will tell you that I've said 10,000 times in my life that most of the evils in the world is from people not paying attention. If we paid attention to the needs of other people, for instance. And then, number 8, right concentration, to meditate on the right things, to think on what is good, right, as well as to meditate. This is the noble eightfold path, or middle way, that Buddha recommended. Now, Buddhism in Japan, let me catch up with my notes here. As I say, the original Theravada Buddhism had no attraction for the people in China, or in Korea, or in Japan. Buddhism came to Japan, and there's 2 different dates. Some people say it was 538, some people say it was 552. But the idea is that the Koreans, first the Chinese, and then the Koreans had adopted Christianity, and then it came over from there to the islands of Japan. So generally 552 is the date that they look at. It came over from Korea. They were influenced by Korean monks coming across with it. But the original Theravada Buddhism, the focus on the reincarnation, samsara, that and just trying to achieve nothingness was not a big attraction to them. And so they developed several other kinds of Buddhism. By the way, the Buddhism all along has said that there are 3 marks or realities of existence. I didn't mention this. 1 is impermanence. Nothing lasts. 2nd is suffering, the dukkha. There is always going to be suffering. And we are blessed. The very fact that we're on this boat means that we probably have a lot less suffering than most of the world does. But we too suffer. We will have loved ones die. We will have sickness. We will know suffering as well. And the 3rd, which is difficult for Westerners to understand, is the concept of existence being non-self. That I'm not the center of the universe, that I need to be able to recognize that as a spiritual being, I am not just this body, and that I need to relate to the spiritual world. That, it's very difficult for us not to realize that basically everybody's here for me, right? It's all about me. And that non-self is a major theme as well. So, in the 12th century in Japan, the shoguns developed. The first of the shoguns came along. They defeated the emperor was really weak. They defeated the other warlords in Japan, and the shogunate was established. So the person who really ran the country from the 12th century on was the shogun, the military leader. Underneath the shogun were these daimyo that we talked about, and we're going to talk about the history of Japan in more detail. The lords that had their own small armies, and then the samurai below that. Well, this was the period of time in the 12th century when Buddhism was coming across to Japan from Korea in a big way. They had been introduced earlier in the 500s, but the shoguns fell in love with this idea of Buddhism, and they really promoted it and encouraged it. That's why then in the 19th century, when the Meiji Restoration happened, because Buddhism had been associated with the shoguns, and the restoration of the Meiji Emperor was denying the power of the shoguns and putting them in their place, the Meiji Emperor didn't want to have Buddhism being very popular, very common. And so there was some major back and forth before eventually they settled much later than Meiji on there being the Shinbutsu Shogu, the combination of the two. All right? I want to talk about the several different brands of Buddhism very quickly here. The most popular brand of Buddhism in Japan is called Pure Land Buddhism. This is the Buddha Amida. Remember, there have been thousands of Buddhas, and there are different ideas about, is that the same one reincarnated, are they different spiritual beings, etc. On either side of Amida Buddha are his 2 supporting bodhisattvas. Do we have any Steely Dan fans in the audience? You know Bodhisattva? You know, the song by Steely Dan, Bodhisattva, said, Bodhisattva, will you take me by the hand? Bodhisattva, Bodhisattva, will you show me your Japan? Will you show me your sparkling China? Bodhisattva, take me by the hand. Well, Bodhisattva are spiritual beings that are well along in being enlightened, But before they finally achieve Buddhahood, they decide to stick around in order to help everybody else out of compassion, rather than crossing over into full enlightenment themselves. And so there are many of the bodhisattvas, and that's what that song is about, take me by the hand, bodhisattva. Lead me into this. Well, the Buddha Amida and the bodhisattvas that support the Buddha Amida, the belief is, this is called Pure Land or sometimes Western Buddhism. The idea is that if you believe and have faith in the Amida Buddha, if you recite chants of faith, particularly the chant is Namu Amida Buddha. If you chant that, and there are different schools. Some people say if you chant it only once, really believing in the Amida Buddha, the Amida Buddha will save you. Literally will take you to the Pure Land, the Promised Land, the heaven. There are very Western kind of ideas in this. Now you see the difference between that and what Gautama Buddha was saying, that the goal is to just no longer exist. The goal here is to have faith that this particular Buddha, Amida Buddha, that if you chant a name praising and have faith that upon your death, the Amida Buddha will take you to a promised land, the Pure Land. The idea being that we can't perfect this life, and so Amida Buddha will provide us with a place that is perfected. I mentioned that this stuff influences gardens, Japanese gardens. When you go into some of the gardens, which I'm sure you'll visit as we are in the islands, and then particularly if you continue on to Yokohama in the second leg, you will see gardens where there will be a bridge that leads to a little island. And then from that island, there will be another section that leads over to the shrine. Those are Pure Land Buddhist shrines. The island symbolizes Amida. That if we will go to Amida, Amida will lead us the rest of the way. And so there are very distinctive features that both will tell you what the motivation was, whether it's Shinto, whether it's Buddhist, etc. But there's an example. The islands that are halfway to the shrines that connect is a representation of Amida Buddha. And again, it's basically a promise of heaven. It's a very westernized kind of idea. Nothing at all like Siddhartha Gautama Buddha represented. A second kind is called Nichiren Buddhism. It is from a priest from the 1200s, a priest called Nichiren. Nichiren Buddhism, very popular. It follows the 300 letters and treatises that he wrote as a Buddhist priest, and it has a focus on the Lotus Sutra, on chanting the Lotus Sutra, and some other sutras as well. But that's a beautiful written sutra for mantras for chanting, and also the idea of he really focused on socio-political responsibility, on being a socially responsible person, and taking political involvement seriously. Nichiren Buddhism at various times, and there are different sects of it, there are a bunch of different kinds of Nichiren Buddhism. Some of them have gotten in real trouble in Japan over the years because some of them have gotten so politically involved that the government has suppressed them. There's two major schools of Nichiren Buddhism. One of them who believes that Nichiren himself was a bodhisattva, that he was an enlightened being who just decided not to take full enlightenment yet out of compassion wanting to help people. The other side says no, he was just a great teacher. Right? So Nichiren Buddhism you will see, and you'll see statues of him. There is then Shingon Buddhism. Shingon Buddhism, Shingon literally means true words. And this is the only real version in East Asia now of the Vajrayana Buddhism, which is the primary Buddhism of Tibet. It's more mystical, it's more esoteric. There are many deities in Shingon Buddhism because it accepts deities from Hinduism, the Vedic deities. In fact, one of the major deities in the Shingon pantheon of gods is Indra, who is the king of heaven in Hinduism. And so they have many different gods that they worship, and that's the reason you get a lot of these kind of images. We today, in our group, we went to the temple of the god of mercy in Buddhism. I don't know, I didn't ask, and I don't know this for a fact, but I believe that probably was a Shingon temple, because there were places for multiple gods to be recognized there, as well as the god of mercy, or goddess of mercy, being the primary one. And then the one you've heard of, Zen Buddhism. Zen, literally, in China, it was called Chin Buddhism. It's called Xian Buddhism in Korea, and then Zen Buddhism in Japan, because it came over. It focuses on meditation. Rather than follow the teachings or the rituals as a way to be enlightened, it's looking for that thunderbolt from heaven, where you personally will be enlightened suddenly. And there are three schools. The largest one, in Japan at least, is called Soto Buddhism, and they focus on some ritual, but it's literally, Soto means sitting around. The idea that if you sit and meditate and just, the Buddha, the original Buddha, sat under a Bodhi tree, which is a Ficus religioso tree, and said he wasn't going to get up until he was enlightened, and he was. So this is the idea of the Soto school. The Rinzai school, the second one, focuses on koans, these mysterious sayings that are supposed to challenge you to give up your rational focus. You've all heard the saying, what is the sound of one hand clapping? Right? Sounds silly. But the idea is for students of the Rinzai school of Zen Buddhism to meditate on that, and then to be able to respond to a teacher or master in a way that is found satisfactory. One of the most famous of the koans that was used in Rinzai Buddhism was, if you meet the Buddha, kill the Buddha. What does that mean? Well, meditating on that is supposed to let you break away from your addiction to rationalism, to become a more spiritual person, to be more in connection with your deeper self, not just let yourself be driven by your rationality. And then there's another one, a third, called Obodu Buddhism, which is the most creative. You've seen these Buddhist monks sitting around with brushes, calligraphy and all of that. Much of that is the Obadu Buddhism. They focused on printmaking and art. They do a lot of, the idea of using that as a meditation form in Zen Buddhism. I have just done a radical injustice both to Shinto and to Buddhism in trying to give all of this to you, but let me ask you now, are there any questions? I always laugh when I ask. Yes?
I was once involved in a Shinto, I was part of a Shinto ceremony that blessed the opening of a Western business office
Right.
In Japan, and I never really understood what the purpose of that was. Why would you have a Shinto priest blessing the opening of a business office?
It's very common. Why would you have a Shinto priest bless an opening of an office building? It is very common in Japan to have Shinto priests especially, sometimes Buddhist priests as well, but primarily Shinto priests come and bless events or buildings or whatever. It is to seek the goodwill and support of the kami that are there, the spirits that are present or will come. The idea that you're recognizing the kami, the spirits, and you're acknowledging them is supposed to lead to good fortune in terms of not having negative spiritual aspects bothering you, but rather having positive spiritual aspects. You will get the same sort of thing. Carolyn and I used to be involved in dragon boating, and they would have priests come and bless the dragon boats before we would actually start the races, because this all started, in China. I mean, these were Chinese priests. It was a Chinese version of Buddhism, but the same kind of idea that you use blessings from the priest to keep on the good side, basically, of the kami, and to make sure that things go well for you. Other questions? Yes?
So you mentioned that there's a lot of overlap between Shinto and Buddhism.
Right.
And what are the statistics in terms of percentage of religion in Japan?
Again, it's difficult. What are the percentages of the different religions? Well, 35% of the people in Japan in a survey in 2008 said they were Buddhist. But we know, and very few people, like 3 or 4%, said they were Shinto. But we know for a fact that 80% of the homes in Japan have Shinto shrines, the Kaminari, the God shelf, where they recognize their ancestors, etc. But they don't see that as a religion. So when they were asked what religion do you belong to, they don't think of Shinto as a religion. But if you've got 35% of the people are Buddhists and say so, there's about 2% Christian, who acknowledge it, at least in surveys, and there's always a problem with surveys there. You've got 35% that are Buddhists and 2% or so that are Christian, and then other little smatterings. But 80% of them are also practicing Shinto by having shrines in their home. Obviously, 35 and 2 and 80 don't add up to 100. People are crossing over. You know, that's the Shibutsu Shogu, the idea of combining a syncretic kind of approach to those religions. But those are the numbers, but you can't rely very heavily on them because they're based on polls that don't make a whole lot of sense to people in Japan. Other questions? Yes?
Does the cherry blossom, when they come into Japan, is that part of the animistic theories or feelings that they get?
Right, when the cherry blossoms come in Japan, is that considered part of the kami acknowledgement? I don't know that for a fact, but I'm sure it would be, because everything is seen as being, for the Shinto, you know, practicing Shintos, would be seen as an expression of the kami, that they have blessed you with this beauty. Or, you know, when a harvest comes in, you have been blessed, the kami have chosen to bless you with the harvest. And you would have priests, you know, blessing the planting of seeds and things of that sort in order for it to go well. So I don't know that for a fact. I mean, I can't quote any reference to that, but I'm sure that probably would be the case. Any other questions? Thank you very much for your attention.